Hi everybody, this is Dan Siri here in the Siri Poetry Library. We're going to do something a little different today. I'm going to get to some poems later. First, I'm going to read a selection from the Neverending Story. Whenever people post memes or post pictures of this on Facebook, I'm like, you got to read the book. It's a billion times better. I know that's usually the case in about 90% of literature turned into film, but this is one time where the book is so much better than the movie. One morning, when time seemed to be standing still in the murky light, he looked out from a hilltop and finally glimpsed the swamps of sadness. Clouds of mist drifted over them. Here and there he distinguished little clumps of trees, their trunks divided at the bottom into 4 or 5 and more crooked slits, which made the trees look like great many-legged crabs standing in the backwater. From the brown foliage hung aerial roots resembling motionless tentacles. It was next to impossible to make out where was solid ground beginning between the pools of water and where there was only a covering of water plants. Artax whinnied with horror. "Are we going in them, master?" "Yes," said Atreyu. "We must find Tortoiseshell Mountain. It's the center of these swamps." He urged Artax, and Artax obeyed. Step by step he tested the firmness of the ground, but that made progress very slow. At length, Atreyu dismounted and led Artax by the bridle several times. The horse sank in, but managed to pull himself loose. The farther they went into the swamps of sadness, the more sluggish became his movements. He let his head droop and barely dragged himself forward. "Artax," said Atreyu, "what's the matter?" "I don't know, master. I think we should turn back. There's no sense in all this. We're chasing after something you only dreamed about. We won't find anything. Maybe it's too late, even now. Maybe the childlike empress is already dead, and everything we're doing is useless. Let us turn back, master." Atreyu was astonished. "Artax," he said, "you've never spoken like this. What's the matter? Are you sick?" "Maybe I am," said Artax. "With every step we take, the sadness grows in my heart. I've lost hope, master, and I feel so heavy I can't go on." "But we must go on," cried Atreyu. "Come along, Artax." He tugged at the bridle, but Artax stood still. He had sunk in up to his belly, and he made no further effort to extricate himself. "Artax," cried Atreyu, "you mustn't let yourself go. Come, pull yourself up, or you'll sink." "Leave me, master," said the little horse. "I can't make it. Go on alone. Don't bother about me. I can't stand the sadness any more. I want to die." Desperately, Atreyu pulled at the bridle, but the horse sank deeper and deeper. With only its head emerging from the black water, Atreyu took it up in his arms. "I'll hold you, Artax," he whispered. "I won't let you go under." The little horse uttered one last soft neigh. "You can't help me, master. It's all over for me. Neither of us knew what we were getting into. Now we know why they are called the swamps of sadness. It's the sadness that's made me so heavy. That's why I'm sinking. There's no help." "But I'm here too," said Atreyu. "Why don't I feel anything?" "You're wearing the gem, master," said Artax. "It protects you." "Then I'll hang it around your neck," Atreyu cried. "Maybe it will protect you too." He started taking the chain off his neck. "No," the little horse whinnied. "You mustn't do that, master. The glory was entrusted to you. You weren't given permission to pass it on as you see fit. You must carry on the quest without me." Atreyu pressed his face into the horse's cheek. "Artax," he whispered. "Oh, my Artax." "Will you grant me one last wish?" the little horse asked. Atreyu nodded in silence. "Then I beg you to go away. I do not want you to see my end. Will you do me that favor?" Atreyu slowly arose. Half the horse's head was already in the black water. Farewell, Atreyu, my master, and thank you. Atreyu pressed his lips together. He couldn't speak. Once again he nodded to Artax and turned away. Bastian was sobbing. He couldn't help it. His eyes filled with tears, and he couldn't go on reading. He had to take out his handkerchief and blow his nose before he could go on. Okay. So, I had gotten the book years ago. I had never read it. It's one of those books that just sat in a pile, as so many books do. I have hundreds of books like that. And one day, I was subbing at a school, and they were taking the test, and I had to sit in the hallway and basically watch the hallway, make sure everybody walked through quietly. But basically, I was sitting there for about 4 hours at a time. So I said, let me bring some books with me. Let me finally get around to Neverending Story, because I'll have 4 hours to just sit without my phone, without distractions, without a TV, and I could finally get some reading done the way I used to read, like when I was a kid, when I used to read so much more. And I regret being an adult and being so distracted and not reading as much. And as I'm reading this book, I'm like, wow, this is really cool. I like how it's different than the movie, but it's some of the things from the movie. It's cool in a case like a fantasy story like Lord of the Rings or Neverending Story to read before you read the book. It's nice to watch the movie so you get some kind of a visual grounding for what things look like. So if you read The Shining, you see Jack Nicholson. If you read, Jaws, you see the guys from there. So visually, it's easy to imagine most of the things in the book because a lot of it has already been done for you. But as I realized the differences, and one of the big ones is that Artax, the horse, can speak. So that was something that I was thinking was very cool. I'm like, oh, that's cool. They couldn't do that in the movie in the 80s, and that's pretty neat. And then I'm like, wait a second. What about the Swamps of Sadness? So I was sort of dreading that passage in the book, and when it came up, I swear, this very rarely happens. I read that section, and I'm sitting in a hallway, and there's some kids walking through the hallway, not many because they're testing. And I was sitting reading this thing, and I was in tears. I was a complete mess reading this scene in the book when the horse is talking. Oh my God. I thought the scene in the movie was hard enough, but this put on a whole new dimension of misery. But once again, definitely read the book. This is just a small portion of how great it is and the work that Mike Glenn put into it. You could easily find it online or the audio version. But it's interesting to see, the changes. And this is definitely a movie that should be readapted. Not by Disney. It's hard because you kind of need the Disney or the Warner Brothers money in something like this. But I would like to see it adapted by people who really care about the book. And are not just like, let's just throw in a bunch of money. And I don't want it to turn out like A Wrinkle in Time, which, the TV movie was better than the big movie that they made a few years ago. A lot of times when they adapt these children's books, they tend to really overdo it. They don't really get the essence of the book and what the book is trying to say. They just basically spend a lot of money and they try to, change things from the book that don't need to be changed. There are certain things you have to do for length and things like that. But today, especially when it comes to children's properties or very famous books, everyone feels like they have to redo it and remake it. Like, I'm dreading the day when they remake all the Harry Potter books again, on HBO Max probably. And they'll make them longer so they'll be more like the books. But what they'll do is they won't understand that sometimes when you adapt a book, this was a big problem with It. We talk about book adaptations for a minute. It is a very problematic book because it's very long, it's very unpleasant, and it has some really things that are really a little too disturbing to really put on a film that are in the book. But you kind of need those things in some ways. That's not the big elephant in the room with, that stuff that happens kind of towards the end of the book with Beverly and the boys, which is awful. Um, and unnecessary completely. It makes no sense, but it's there. Um, but the biggest problem with that story is that it was a very hard book to adapt. And the best thing to have done is, because the adult story is not interesting at all, in my opinion. The only thing that made it interesting in the book was that it would keep going back between the adult story and the children's story. So when they decided to make the movie and they made just the children's story, it was the best version of it you'll ever see, because the kid's story was interesting, because it wasn't so much about being bullied by the clown or the evil spirit as much as it was also being bullied by regular people and regular kids. There was much more menace. When they were adults, they were just basically complaining about their lives, and I'm like, this is like really not working for me. So then when they split up the movies the way that they did it, if they were to make a supercut that would go back and forth, it would be much more interesting. But I don't think they're going that route. And ironically, the TV movie, when you saw the first part of it, you're like, oh, wow, this blows the TV movie out of the water. But when you saw the second part, the TV movie, in some ways, even though it's made on a much lower budget and there's a lot of stuff wrong with it, a lot of problems, the TV movie wins.